You know, going by how I felt about this movie, I just call it the pretty good Spider-Man. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel and another installment in my Spider-Man review series, where I review every single Spider-Man movie in the lead up to No Way Home. And today we're talking about the first reboot, The Amazing Spider-Man. So before we begin, let me know in the comments what your thoughts on this movie were if you already saw it, or if you were planning on seeing it, and make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these reviews, as it helps me out immensely by getting my content out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with reviews of new releases, older films, hidden gems, and so much more on a near daily basis. But let's jump right into it and let's talk about The Amazing Spider-Man. This stars Andrew Garfield as high school student Peter Parker. After he's bitten by a genetically altered spider, he gains newfound spider-like powers and ventures out to save the city from the machinations of a mysterious reptilian foe. So before we go any further, as I've been doing with each of these reviews, this is going to be filled with spoilers. So if you haven't seen The Amazing Spider-Man yet and wish to know absolutely nothing, this is your spoiler warning. Go watch the movie, then come back to this. But anyway, here we go. After Sam Raimi walked away from making any further Spider-Man movies due to the interference by Sony for both Spider-Man 3 and the planned Spider-Man 4, it was decided to just reboot the entire franchise rather than continuing on without him. So Mark Webb, a last name I always found fitting for this, is brought in to direct along with an entirely new cast to take over, with this focusing on a mix of some major characters from the old films as well as minor characters from those films who are now given a much more prominent role here. And by this point, now 10 years after the first Sam Raimi film, the state of superhero movies was considerably different. The Dark Knight had been released, and now every major franchise was doing some sort of gritty reboot of old beloved characters, and it was now seen as much more acceptable to take them 100% seriously. And meanwhile, the Marvel Cinematic Universe had gotten underway, introducing Iron Man, Thor, Captain America, and others. And this was actually released the same year as The Avengers, which at the time was one of the biggest superhero crossovers ever. And all those films, like they are now, were known for being these huge, fun spectacles that audiences can still find believable in some way. So a lot has changed since the very first Spider-Man. So tonally, this goes in a bit of a different direction than the Sam Raimi films. It follows a lot of the same beats as the 2002 movie, but their paths also diverge in several key areas. But in its handling of all that material, old and new, it goes more for what I'd say is an in-between of what DC was doing with The Dark Knight and what Marvel was doing with The Avengers. This is definitely a darker take on Spider-Man, grounding the character, honing in a lot of its more emotional elements, and removing a lot of the campier elements presented in the Raimi films. But it would still lightly sprinkle in bits of comedic relief, and it would still have its moments where it felt like a huge spectacle once again, just maybe not as much. And its final result is one that I'd say is pretty good. This was always a film that was somewhat hard to judge because you want to be able to look at movies based on their own individual merits. However, with this, it served as a reboot of Spider-Man which went through his origins once again, even though we just saw his origins done in a film literally just 10 years prior. And because Spider-Man's origins are a very specific set of dramatic beats, we wind up revisiting some of the same material that we just got in the 2002 film. So even though this was a movie that was trying to do its own thing, which it did to a degree, it also had to repeat a number of the same plot points seen in the first Raimi film. And even though it did several of those plot points differently from that film, sometimes you can't help but just start making comparisons, and you think of this in relation to what was done in a movie literally just 10 years ago. But depending on your opinion of the Raimi films, that can be either a good thing or a bad thing. If you love the Raimi movies, you might inadvertently see this in a bit more of a negative light because you'll probably think that it did it better, which personally I think it did. But also, like I said, due to how superhero movies came such a long way in that 10 years, even by that point, people would then go back to those movies and they found them to age horribly. So for that audience, this was seen as a breath of fresh air, especially since it was still at the height of the quote-unquote dark superhero craze. Now for me, as someone who loved the first two Raimi movies and kinda enjoyed the third one, I'd still say that I enjoyed this one as well. Even though I hold a lot of nostalgia for those movies and thought they brought to life the Spider-Man lore perfectly, I still appreciated this take on the character, even if I wouldn't call this one of my favorite Spider-Man movies. But it's still enjoyable overall. So we'll start with the casting of Spider-Man himself. Andrew Garfield, I think, is going to go down as the most underappreciated of all the Spider-Men. Tobey Maguire was the first live-action Spider-Man, and his first two movies are beloved, and people hold a lot of nostalgia for them, while Tom Holland is the MCU version, and a lot of people really enjoy his incredibly funny personality, as well as enjoy that he gets to interact with all the Avengers and cross over with all these characters. But then you have Andrew Garfield in this in-between phase for the character, where superhero movies were becoming bigger and bolder, and you now had all this crossover between them, but due to no deal yet being worked out between Marvel and Sony, you still had Spider-Man, who was not only just doing his own thing, separate from the bigger Marvel universe, but once again retreading some of the same territory as another more beloved standalone movie that came 10 years before it. And I wouldn't be surprised if the film as a whole was more known for just the constant comparisons it had to the 2002 film. So I feel Garfield doesn't get quite as much recognition as he should have gotten for the role. I mean, don't get me wrong, he is liked, especially by Spider-Man fans, but rarely do I ever hear anyone say that he was their favorite version of the character. Though I will say, I do think he was a very good Spider-Man. But he does fall into a problem that's a reverse of Maguire, not that I'm looking to turn this whole thing into a comparison. But whereas Tobey Maguire was a great Peter Parker, nailing down the awkwardness and emotional intensity of the character, his Spider-Man was good, but it certainly wasn't the witty, insulting, fast-talking character that longtime fans of Spider-Man are used to. He was still great, and a mostly comic-accurate representation of the character, but there was that one tiny flaw. Garfield, on the other hand, nailed the fast-talking nature of Spider-Man when in the suit, taunting his enemies, making fun of them as he wrapped them up in webs, and laughing to himself the entire time. However, his take on Peter outside of the suit was a bit hit and miss, at least for me. Now, it's not that they don't try making Peter, once again, this nerdy, awkward high school student, because they do, but of course they want to capture that without doing just a copy and paste of Maguire, who was simply very soft-spoken and sometimes at a loss for words. Garfield conveys Peter's awkwardness through a lot of stuttering, repeating himself, and being extremely jittery. And it's fine. I get they were especially trying to distance themselves from doing what Maguire did, and I know that there are people who stumble over their words in real life the way he does here. That's something I used to do a lot as a kid myself, so I get it. But that's mostly how he spoke when not in the suit for like the majority of the movie. And it becomes a bit tiresome after a while. Not that that's literally all there is to his personality, but a good majority of his lines are delivered that way, and truth be told, it can feel a little bit exhausting, at least for me personally. Now, there is a charm underneath there. I'm not saying it's bad, and we do see Garfield try making a few jokes to cover up some of the stumbling, and he does try to bring out the more emotional side to Peter. It just felt maybe a bit too one note at times for me. But to be clear, he wasn't a completely flat character. He still had some solid emotional beats to work with. Like, once again, the film does try to hone in a bit on the themes of taking responsibility for one's actions, as seen once more with his relationship with Uncle Ben, which is considerably a bit harsher this time around than it was in the first Raimi film. Martin Sheen and Sally Field play Uncle Ben and Aunt May respectively, and even though they're still portrayed as being much older, they're still about 10 to 15 years younger here than when Cliff Robertson and Rosemary Harris were when they played those characters in the Raimi films. So instead of the gentler, more grandparent-like figures, these are versions who act even more as if they were Peter's actual parents, with Uncle Ben in particular mixing his kindness and wisdom with moments where he can be a lot sterner. So when Peter and Uncle Ben have a falling out, it's a lot more heated, like a parent arguing with their own kid, with Uncle Ben trying to drive the point home even more so about thinking of others and taking responsibility for one's actions in a somewhat aggressive way. It can feel a little jarring from what we're used to, but I gotta say, I do like this take where it's meant to feel like a true, more direct wake-up call. And of course, Martin Sheen himself does a great job with this take on Uncle Ben, as does Sally Field as Aunt May. I do think in these sequences, again, Garfield was maybe still a bit too jittery when going back at them, even as he's supposed to have gained more confidence, so it distracts a bit from some of the emotional weight these sequences are meant to have, but he was fine here. There's also a subplot introduced in this film that we do see explored a bit more in the second regarding Peter trying to find out what happened to his parents, which was never really a part of the Spider-Man mythology that was explored too deeply to my knowledge. We see a flashback in the beginning of them being these esteemed scientists who have to take an emergency trip, and they drop a young Peter off with Uncle Ben and Aunt May, though they never come back. But what happens is this drives Peter forward for a lot of the film, in addition to the guilt he feels from Uncle Ben's death. He still wants to know exactly what happened to them. It's a big part of his growth. It's how he first comes into contact with Dr. Connors, who we find out was a friend of theirs. And while it isn't explored quite as in-depth as I would have liked, it still becomes integral to the development of his character through both of these movies. So I like this new addition to the origin story. But once Garfield suits up as Spider-Man, that's when he really gets his moment to shine, and he's clearly having an absolute blast with the role. I do like this notion that having been this kid who was bullied on sight for most of his life, now that he can hide his face and no one knows who he is, it gives him the confidence to finally say what he wants and do what he wants without having to worry about what someone may think in case he knows them. Plays into a bit of a different set of themes that we're used to with Spider-Man while still staying true to the character. Especially with the rise of the internet and social media at that time, how we tend to gain a lot more confidence when we're behind a keyboard and we don't have to look someone right in the eye when we tell them what we really want to tell them. I liked how it played on this idea of duality a lot more, where we feel like we become different people when we've had that extra layer between us. Because once he becomes Spider-Man, he's clearly a lot more confident, but whenever he takes the suit off, he goes back to being very jittery and stuttering again. And part of his growth is realizing through suiting up as Spider-Man what his true potential is and what he's actually capable of. And that helps him grow a lot, not just as Spider-Man, but as Peter Parker himself. So while I wasn't exactly head over heels the way his awkwardness was conveyed, I do like the themes evoked here. Now, our other major star is Emma Stone as Gwen Stacy, who is probably the absolute best part about both this and the sequel, honestly. While I like Kirsten Dunst's Mary Jane and do think there's more to her than being just a damsel in distress, Gwen is shown to be the antithesis of Mary Jane. What makes her stand out a lot more here is that she's shown to be just as hands-on as Peter, and she plays a very active part in a lot of the movie's events. She may not have the strength Peter has, but she's very smart, she understands what the assignment is, and she's willing to run with it. She has no problem putting herself in harm's way to work hand in hand with Spider-Man, and will often take the initiative to get herself involved. And that makes her just as compelling as Peter, if not a more compelling character. And what helps too is that Emma Stone gives a fantastic performance. She's very funny, and she has a lot of moments to shine during the action scenes, and she also has some truly wonderful chemistry with Garfield, with the two feeling so natural playing off one another. Plus, we do get a solid little subplot where she tries to elude her dad, Captain Stacy, played by an always reliable Dennis Leary, who still tries to maintain a bit too much control on her life, despite his best of intentions of not wanting to see his daughter be put in danger. And that was one of the better subplots of this film, just because Dennis Leary's always a welcome addition. Plus, it did a great job of giving Gwen more character development, establishing her as a very strong, independent person, but also someone who cares deeply for others. I did also like that they made the decision for Peter to reveal his identity as Spider-Man about halfway through the film to Gwen, which was a great moment that not only allowed these films to once again do something a little different, but also set the stage for her to get considerably more to do, as that also inspired her to want to take on a more active role in some of the more dangerous parts of this venture. And speaking of the action, in general, it was all pretty solid here for the most part. This time around, there's much more of an emphasis on digital effects rather than the mix of practical and special effects as seen in the Raimi trilogy, but by this time, CGI has especially come a really long way, and it allows for so much more to be done here, with the film having more of a polished feel than the Raimi trilogy, which I will say is one of the few improvements this made over those films. And it allows for a lot more to be done with our main villain, that being Rhys Ifans as Curt Connors, aka the Lizard. We saw him pre-transformation as a supporting character in Spider-Man 2 and 3, but this time he's front and center as our main villain. And for that notion, I was happy, though in regards to his actual character development, I was a bit mixed. On one hand, the effects for the character look great, and I never got this hokey sense to how he looked. And I do like that Dr. Connors is given this big sympathetic background where we get into his history with Peter's father. He's driven by a desire to do the right thing, which is why he's conducting all these experiments, especially so he can regrow his missing arm. And Ifans just does a great job as Dr. Connors, as well as the Lizard himself. But this goes back to what I said at the top of this review, where even though this is a film looking to do something different with Spider-Man, it still repeats a number of the same plot points as the Raimi movies, and it's even more apparent when watching this not too long after watching those films. I don't want a movie to suffer simply for its comparisons to another film, but at this point, it just feels so familiar. It's like how if we were to criticize a non-franchise movie that's technically an original story, but still feels by the numbers, even though we're not really comparing it to anything specific. Because here, I mean, the Lizard may not exactly be the same as the Green Goblin or Doc Ock, but he's yet another brilliant scientist who wants to do the right thing, and he has these good intentions, and he does this experiment, and it goes wrong, and there's still a lot of good hidden underneath him, but he also has this split personality that makes him lose his mind, and I appreciate at the very least he's still a sympathetic guy, so I don't dislike him. And as I said previously, that's always what made Spider-Man's villains a lot more compelling than other rogues galleries. And the fight scenes with him, especially in the third act, were great. But it's basically following the formula these two other movies did, just with a different character. The fact his powers are a little different can't hide the fact that it feels like we've seen this before. And that's kind of why I don't necessarily love this movie. I like it for sure. I think it deserves a little more credit than it got, but this was a film that tried to have it both ways, and to a degree, I get it. It wanted to do something different with the character and provide a clean slate for him, and whenever it does diverge from the Raimi material, it really shines. However, because it was looking to completely start over, it had to go back to the character's beginnings, and because Spider-Man has a very famous, already established mythology that you really can't deviate from too much as it's integral to his character, it caused the film to repeat a lot of the same beats we've already seen on film, which made it feel a bit boxed in and not able to properly flourish and completely do its own thing, which is a shame considering anytime this does get to truly deviate from what we've already seen, it really works. The Amazing Spider-Man is a solid film overall, even if it doesn't exactly live up to its name. It offers a fresh take on the character that can take itself more seriously than ever before, due to how popular superhero movies have become by this point, and it benefits from a great cast, with the chemistry between Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone being one of the film's highlights. Plus, the film does have some really polished special effects, but the problem is, it repeats too many of the same beats as the first Raimi film, almost backing itself into a corner at times and giving it this sense of familiarity, even though it was trying to do something different at the same time. So it never really got to take off the way it should have. Still, it's an enjoyable movie that still stays true to the character, and it can be very entertaining at times. So while it's not necessarily the best Spider-Man movie, it's still another solid entry in Spider-Man's filmography. The Amazing Spider-Man gets a 7.5 out of 10. Still a pretty solid movie overall. I know it's one that didn't get quite as much credit as it should, but I still thought it was a good time, especially whenever it diverged from the 2002 film. But stay tuned, as up next will be my review of The Amazing Spider-Man 2. And in the meantime, let me know, did you see The Amazing Spider-Man, or are you planning to see it, and what were your thoughts? Did you think it was a better take on Peter's origin story, and do you prefer Andrew Garfield or Tobey Maguire? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it, and for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching everyone, and keep having fun with film.